to put into our CTF. So completely kind of turned it on its head and went bottom out, right? So what this meant was we were able to do things and then tie this into the atomic red team or other things, actually pull out and put into our CTF the actual quantified, knowledgeable things that Casey and others have put into atomic red team that are based on citable research that was found in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and then put that into our CTF, right? So if we had ever had, as I have, we once had a customer come up to me and say, this is completely unrealistic, I'm a pen tester, and this would never happen. I was like, what? She's like, add user? No APT actors. Advanced, Ryan, stands for advanced. It's like, well, okay, I get it, but here's the T number, and here's the 75 malware reports that show evidence of a nation state actor using add user. Oh, right. The whole idea here is a scientific method we've gone through, we've reversed it, and we have citable knowledge. It's an awesome educational tool. But we're really lazy, and this year we want to try something new. I'll turn it over to Dave.
Okay, so one of the things that we do every year is our big user conference. Is where we do our Boss of the SOC, and we're always expected to come up with talks. So this year we created some adversary emulation tooling that sits on top of Splunk. There's a couple guys that worked on this a lot. So myself and Tim and Kyle. So we presented this a couple weeks ago at our user conference. So a lot of the tooling, we did a full 45-minute presentation on that. If you want to check that out, it goes in deep into all the kind of bits and bytes. Here's a link to the slides in the video. But I'll kind of talk about what this tooling is and how we used it for some of the stuff we did in this talk. So basically, we created what I like to say is kind of like a rapid iteration, a rapid development environment for developing data that you can use to generate analytics. So I'll just walk through this real quickly. But if you start with kind of a Splunk platform, we integrated the Attack Navigator into a Splunk dashboard, which in and of itself is kind of a neat thing. Could reduce some spreadsheets possibly. So we have an Attack Navigator. I'll show you some screenshots of that in a bit. We added some sort of custom actions to that, the right-click actions to select a technique and run that essentially against systems of your choice in order to generate data. So we have the Attack Navigator as kind of the front end, a simulation runner, which allows you to add some configuration options in. And then we send that over to Phantom. Phantom's another Splunk product that we acquired earlier this year. It's an orchestration and automation platform. So we built an Atomic Red Team app for that. So it downloads the Atomic Red Team GitHub repo from GitHub, stores it locally, and then exposes actions for running those tests against systems of your choice. And we wrote a playbook that implements those actions or puts them into use. If you look at the lower kind of right there, we have systems. In this case, and I've heard the term, by the way, this week or the last couple of days, the perfect being the enemy of the good, and I never have that problem. So if you look at this code, you'll be like, hey, here's a person who's willing to publish things that are just barely working. So you'll see
literally the only reason, we swear to God, we just
that's right.
We don't want to be accused of perfection.
That's right. The dashed lines down there around OS 10, or I should say Mac OS and Linux, are because that's the playbook isn't done for those, but we have it working for Windows. But ultimately, we run these Atomic Red Team tests that represent MITRE attack techniques against Windows in this case, and this is a system that should represent your fleet, right? It should have the controls that you have in place on your systems, right? It should be representative. We have a Splunk Universal Forwarder on there that forwards the logs over back into Splunk. I should say on the Windows system, we kept it pretty simple. We just put sysmon and a decent sort of Windows logging policy plus sysmon with the Taylor Swift on security configuration, which is pretty standard, I think. And then we send that data right back into Splunk. The way we originally delivered this was kind of talking about some of the detections that we have in some of our products. But for this talk, I want to instead talk about, okay, when that data comes back into Splunk, which is an analytics platform, how do you then use that to maybe build new detections that are customized to your environment, but are driven by the MITRE attack techniques and by the Atomic Red Team tests. All right. So yeah, Atomic Red Team, I said to throw this out here because none of the stuff that we did would have been possible without having a library of tests. So
And I'm actually really glad he did, because this is a relatively unknown tool, especially in MITRE ATT&CK. So if you haven't heard of Atomic Red Team, I should definitely check it out. There's some presentations.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks to those guys. I tweeted yesterday about this, but you think the world of the folks at Red Canary, because the amount of stuff that they contribute back to the community is really amazing. They set a really, really good example for vendors that I think, from the vendor side, we should all try and follow like that level of commitment. I'm pretty impressed by that. All right. So yeah, the Attack Navigator, obviously very powerful tool, spreadsheet killer. So this is something that we really wanted to put into a dashboard inside of Splunk. So we created this app that does exactly that, and you can check that out. I think if nothing else, we package this up as its own thing. It's not really part of all the rest of the tooling, because it might be useful to a lot of folks out there. It was not easy to do. One of those guys whose picture I showed earlier spent a lot of time getting the two styles of JavaScript, I'll say, to live happily together. But one of the things that we did, I think the primary thing we wanted to accomplish was to make it into a front end for this tooling that we built. And it's pretty easy actually in the Attack Navigator to build to add in new right-click actions or new context actions. So we added one. It says run demo up there, but it should say run test or run technique. And you can add in those types of things, so it makes it really easy for a user to click on that. It takes them ultimately to another page where they select hey, which of those targets do I want to run this against? Those types of things, and then ultimately kicks off that series of events. So one of the things that became obvious, and I really enjoyed the talks, especially this morning. Good talks from Kyle and from the guys at Endgame. And the reason I like those talks so much is because they were bringing up topics that if you actually are building detections against the techniques in MITRE, they're things that you run up against, right? And you can just kind of tell when people have actually done it, and you just sort of nod your head like, yeah, I've been down that road before. So kind of in that vein, one of the things that we ran into, right, was sort of isolating the results of these tests. So when you run the test and generate some logs and trying to figure out exactly what events were a result of the test running, what are just background noise of things happening on the system, and what might be part of what I call scaffolding, right? So when you build an automated framework to push these things out to a remote system, you're going to have used something to do that. Like in our case, we rely on WinRM in a lot of cases, right? WinRM could be an adversary tool, right? In some cases, so you have to be careful to isolate the things that you want to write your detections on. So we created this concept of, or not created, but we thought of this concept, very simple, but basically writing logs. Purposely writing logs. I think somebody mentioned a similar technique this morning, but writing something into the log that you can key off of. So we create a GUID. In Splunk, we write to that to our index, and we say, hey, we're about to kick off this test. And when it reaches Phantom says same thing, writes to the same index with the same GUID, like, hey, we received the message, we're about to kick off this test. And then even to the point where on the Windows system itself, we put into the playbook so that the Windows system will write such a log, right, with the same GUID to its logs using just a command line event create command. And then we do the same thing at the end, right? Write those same three events. And then when we go to look at this from a detection capability point of view, right, we can find the start event, we can find the end event. We can turn that into two epoch timestamps, and that gives us a range of time that we specifically want to look at, and we can eliminate everything else. So that was something that helped us a lot. If you're embarking on this kind of a project, I would recommend using this technique. It turned out to kind of power a lot of, made it a lot easier to do a lot of the things that we're trying to accomplish. So you look at the bottom here, there's a couple things. We only had Sysmon, right? So, but you know, in your environment, maybe you have carbon black, or maybe you have, you know, titanium, or you might even have other controls that aren't host-based, right? That you expect to fire when you see certain things. Like maybe you have, yeah, I don't know, your next-gen firewall or your IDS or something, and you're hoping those things or expecting those things to capture certain of these techniques, right? So that would totally work just fine in this world. In this case, I'm only showing Sysmon again. The minimum viable MVT, minimum viable talk. So that was the only showing Sysmon, but there could be lots of other controls that you have in place there. That kind of the Sysmon not event code equal 1 is kind of showing some things that we found in this particular example, which was the you know, creating a registry for a start event or a startup item. So you see there's some evidence in the Sysmon item or event code 13 showing that a registry change was made. And then down below, you see a few things. There's a little bit of the scaffolding that I mentioned kind of sneaking in there. Those first few events are saying on how to sort of tune an analytic, or the sort of the path that you go through, right? The sort of stages that you go through in writing an analytic. You find something, you know, you write a search that finds that thing. You realize, oh, I kind of overfit to that example. That's, you know, not finding things because of that, and then you adjust the other way, and then you start getting false positives, and you know, finding the right the right sort of balance there is kind of different for every organization. But in this case, we just a pretty simple Splunk search here. We're that first line in the search is looking for our two timestamps, right? The beginning and end, which we got from taking the time to write those start and end events. We're doing some decoding. The way that we are sending the data in to the Windows endpoint in this situation is using WinRM, and then having it run a PowerShell command, and PowerShell commands are encoded. So another opportunity to mistake the delivery mechanism that we intended for something that's actually malicious. So you want to be aware of that. We do some decoding of the base 64 there, and ultimately, you know, display that stuff. We again see those. We see some of those event create commands, but then ultimately we see, you know, what the adversary was actually doing in that test. And you know, you can write your detection on that, right? You can look for certain strings, look for command line options, right? A lot of different techniques, I think, that have been described quite a bit already today, so I won't dwell on those. But you know, you want to avoid anything that is easily changed by the adversary, or that you would even expect the adversary to change, like, you know, paths to certain things, and that I guess that sort of data that's, or the portions of that command line that are likely to change, right? You want to avoid those. So, in conclusion.
One more thing. So we found, as we were going through this, you know, I want to rain on the MITRE day for the last 2 days a bit. We started doing these APT style groups. So we started using the MITRE attack framework, and we started trying to map things. And we found some very exciting differences of opinion as you start trying to map tactics. So one of the things we did was we wrote up all the methods from the previous year that we had attacked an organization. And then we kind of did a blind test of ascribing techniques to those things. So today, I think today and yesterday, we've heard that MITRE attack is over-prescriptive, and we've heard that it's under-prescriptive. So I think somewhere in the middle is obviously the right place. I personally would always prefer to be over-subscriptive so that we can just have a better taxonomy of knowledge, which kind of leads into the next part. ATT&CKcon last year, new research came out for this APT group, and we found out that there were actually 2 different APT groups for ATT&CKcon. The group had actually bifurcated, and now we have ATT&CKcon Lager and ATT&CKcon Stout. So, yes, I like beer. So, the ATT&CKcon Stout group is really premised of your traditional nation state adversary, brick and mortar, kind of going in for IP, doing that sort of stuff. All the things we're pretty much basically what I've been doing for the last 20 years. Taedongdong Lager, however, is they're the millennials of the hacker groups, right? These are the kids who are all about the Bitcoins. They're all about the AWS and the Lambda functions. They're trying to get all up into that Microsoft Office 365 cloud. They're trying to spin up VMs and AWS to run malicious things. And we said, this is awesome. Let's really break some new ground, right? We're not hearing a lot about this. So cool, let's do this. Let's go right into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and God, we're gonna document the hell out of this. Oh, sad cloud. Sad cloud. Taedongdong Lager is still running rampant. This sucks, frankly. This isn't a MITRE problem. This is an industry problem. Try to find cloud compromises online. Try to find documentation about people who've been popped in Office 365, AWS, Google, anything, right? Pretty much all you'll find is IAM compromises, which is still basically, there was a quote the other week at the SANS Blue Team Hunting or the SANS Hunting Conference, where someone said, you don't hack the account, you log in, right? That's what we're doing, right? With the cloud, most of the time it's not hacking. It's not a sexy ODE. It's really just hacking the human and getting a login and password. So it is difficult, and I don't envy those of us in the room who have been assigned, and I'm sure someone has, to trying to come up with documentation. I, for one, I'll stand right here and volunteer to help however I can. I know Dave is. I would love for the rest of the room and the community to contribute more to this, because we don't get to have tasty things like MITRE ATT&CK frameworks without tasty data to put into it, right? So that's my call to action for everyone in the room and myself. So this is the crap that we ended up with for Taedongdong Lager. We had to pretend. We had to put on our how would I hack the cloud. You'll notice the fidelity for this is significantly less than Taedongdong style. Each one of those I was mostly able to. Sometimes I was talking to people and like writing things on a napkin, like if this happened, blink twice. No one's willing to comment on it. No one's willing to be able to give me data. I can't look in the logs. And God forbid you try to look at logs in either of these two platforms. They can either get underwhelming or overwhelming really fast. So we've had some practical experience kind of delving into this. I'm looking forward to advances in the MITRE cloud. Like I said, please help them and we'll help, and everyone should help. So now an actual WikiHow conclusion.
An actual conclusion. So hopefully there's a few ideas here that you can take away. I think the first one, obviously, if you're at this conference and you're still here at this conference, you believe that adversary simulation is helpful and that it can help with lots of things, in particular security analytic development, which is something that we spend a lot of time on. I think that the tooling is increasingly available. There's a lot of vendors here, there's at least a couple of vendors here that do exactly that thing that I cobbled together, right, in a much more comprehensive and professional way. So there's also, as evidence, I guess, by this talk, there's things popping up out there. I know the whole reason I wanted to do this entire project was a talk that I saw from Chris Gates last year about his Meta project. So that kind of tooling is out there and increasingly available. And so I'd say, take advantage of it.
One of the things I just love, I remember when the purple team term came out, and I was a little dubious at first. And now I absolutely love it. I'm a huge advocate for it. And I feel like it's really come to its own in the last couple months or last year or so. We had a lot of talks today for people who've productionalized purple teaming. It's no longer, let's just put the red team and the blue team in the same room and see what happens. I love the talk by the Deloitte guys from the Netherlands, Olaf and Vincent, where they actually talked about a defined process and the value that can be extracted from implementing these two people and getting that knowledge into the blue team. And, of course, if that doesn't work, if that's too big of an issue,
Tiny purple?
Tiny purple?
Tiny purple?
Little
yeah.
purple? Little purple? Just micro purple.
Micro purple. I thought it was micro
That's my
purple.
nickname.
Just do a little purple if you can't do the whole purple.
And of course, if nothing else, I feel like we're all going to be employed at least for the next 10 to 20 years. We haven't solved cyber, but what I love about MITRE ATT&CK, the reason I am an absolute advocate for it, it gives us a language and a taxonomy to have conversations like this that I've never been able to have before. And like I said, my area of research for the next year is cloud. And I want to be able to have those conversations where we're not just talking two different languages as soon as possible.
Yep. So if you're interested in some of the stuff I was talking about earlier, here's links to everything. We'll tweet those out. We kind of broke them up into pieces that we thought people might be interested in separately. the Attack Navigator, Splunk. These are all on my GitHub right now. We're getting them into the proper ways to distribute these for our day job. But they're out on GitHub right now. So the Attack Navigator and the Splunk dashboards, one app, a simulation runner for Splunk, which is kind of some plumbing that would make all that possible, or that helps make all that possible. And then there's a playbook for Phantom, a simulation playbook for Phantom, and an Atomic Red Team app.
And I would point out as well that both of these can be run, Phantom and Splunk, on the free versions of Splunk.
Yeah.
So there's no need to go out and buy a whole bunch of Splunk. I mean, you should, because Papa needs a new Ferrari. But otherwise, you can run it all for free, especially when you're doing dev and test.
Yeah, this actually, it's a use case that drives literally kilobytes of log volume into your Splunk instance, like on a weekly basis. So and it's not a huge data consumer. So definitely feel free to check out the free versions.
I'm Ryan Kovar.
I'm Dave Harold.
Thanks a lot.
So we could probably take a couple of minutes for questions. Are there any questions? In the back there, can someone? Thank you, Nancy.
We lost our microphone quarterback. He's icing his shoulder, getting ready for the next conference.
He's on the DL.
Yeah, he's on the DL.
He's in the bench, working on sticks.
He's taking matters into his own hands.
I'm worried. There's a notebook.
Yeah.
Intimidating when people have a notebook of questions.
I have a two-part question about the capture the flags. The first thing is, what do you do to simulate noise in the environment? And the second question is, for complex, say, multi-day compromises you want to simulate and things you want to repeat, do you replay that each time, or do you have another method in which you could make it seem fresh?
Sure. So for noise, we actually run the whole thing, and we create a whole fake network. So we stand up, it's kind of like a cyber barn raising. We stand up a whole fake company. We stand up fake or real Active Directory servers. We do everything. It's not generated data. What we do for noise is we then collect a second data set that is actually people doing what we would consider average work, and we apply that. The previous 2 years, we then have a very clever colleague of ours named Jim Afker, who wrote some very fun stuff to introduce noise, and he replayed it over the whole thing. This year, we decided we didn't want to do that. So what we did instead was did a smaller slice of data temporally, but we actually then did a full day work of actually doing day-to-day stuff that we then applied over the top and tried to keep everything as normal. In terms of multi-day attacks, that's actually a very important part of this. So the previous two versions of this CTF, what we would do is we'd collect the naughty stuff in sequence and then apply appropriately for time zone. So for example, you may have noticed Taedong Gong Stout was 8.5 at the time originally, because it was a year or two before we got super friendly. So we actually adjusted everything for phase 1 and phase 2. So our idea was you have the advanced, or you have the baby first attacker who's sending out the spear phishing emails, and they get on the network. Maybe they're working Western hours. And then you have the tier 2 attacker who gets the handover, and they're actually working more the advanced exploits, which was a lot more power, PowerShell M player and doing lateral movement. They would be adjusted to 8.5, and we would just move the epoch date appropriately and inject into the data as needed.
And so we do also release this data, so that's one of the things that we're proud of, that we convinced a software company to give away some of their stuff, which is this data. So we do release it, and in the second version, the data got really big because we did almost everything Ryan just talked about. It got giant, and we realized, when we release this data and people need to download, I think the first year the data is like 6 gig or something. It's pretty reasonable. Second year it was way bigger than that, and so we're trying to figure out the right way to make it realistic, but also make it something that that we can release to the community and people can consume reasonably. And by not putting in quite as much of what we call the clean data, it helps us accomplish that without diminishing the value of the data set too much.
So version 1 is open source and available now. Version 2 will be open source and available December, January-ish.
Thank you.
Cool.
Any other questions? If not, please join me in thanking Ryan and Dave.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. There you go, sir.
Thank you. All right, you have stuck it out. So everyone who's still here gets a car. You'll just see them at the registration desk. It says closing keynote, but it's really just some closing thoughts, because as I was looking at and thinking back what we've done over the last couple of days, what you've done, is really not a whole lot new I can add, but there are just some key points that I can try to emphasize. Because I look back, everything from John Lambert's opening keynote, all the way just to Ryan and Dave's last talk, I just seen such an incredible breadth of content, different perspectives. It's really been a pretty awesome experience. I know for the folks from MITRE, we've probably gotten more out of it than just about anyone. So it's just a couple of themes that I wanted to hit here. And the first is, this word kept coming into my head, this is big. And I think back to when I started at MITRE 16 months ago. So, as we heard when I interviewed Blake, what was that? 6 days ago when we started this conference, it seems that way. Attack, started in 2013, released in 2015. I can't take any credit for it, but coming in from the outside, I saw, wow, this is big. We're going to use this as the foundation for our cyber threat intelligence strategy, and it was clearly a good decision, because what we're building on is something that I think one of the themes I heard from all of these talks is it's practical. People aren't talking about theory, they're talking about practice. They're talking about specific ways that attack is relevant in their environment. With all of its flaws and all of its blemishes and all the places we can grow and improve it, this is about how we're trying to make security easier and better. And that's big. This event is big. Whether it's in terms of the number of people we had here, or the number of people we had on the live stream, the number of views we've had, the impact that this event has had is big. And thanks to everyone who's tweeted about it. We really appreciate that. This is a big problem space. How many times do we need to read reports that say, we're losing in cybersecurity, the adversaries are winning it? It's true in many cases because the problem space is big, but I think this community is figuring out a way to try to make it a little smaller. And the impact of this work is big. I think, and at the risk of overstatement, the work that we are doing collectively actually may result in measurable advances and significant advances in the state of cybersecurity over time. That's a pretty big deal. Ultimately, because every talk at a threat conference needs to reference David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain. I think we're getting a little closer to driving adversaries to that very unpleasant place at the top of the Pyramid of Pain. The other thing, and the word that is often thrown around in lots of contexts, and it's not particularly meaningful, or it's a marketing term, or it's just something that people are aspiring to, is community. I don't think we've overused that term here. I don't think we've used it inappropriately. I have seen a real community that already existed, but a community that's gotten much stronger over the last couple of days. Every time I went out and saw people talking, I saw different groups. I didn't see the same people talking to the same people each time. And building that community is so important because it relies on communication. Communication begets trust. Trust begets cooperation. The other important aspect of this community is its diversity. So we had talking over the last couple of days and in attendance, We had vendors of cybersecurity products and services. We had end users from large financial institutions, from major manufacturers, from smaller organizations, from insurance companies. We had government representatives. We had research and development organizations. That's a pretty diverse group of people who do lots of different things, but all focused around understanding the adversary to improve cybersecurity. And that's a pretty big deal. So how do we foster this community? How do we build this community? Well, that's really what's next. I like to think that attack is actually just the foundation of something that we've been referring to more and more as threat-informed defense. And that is using an understanding of adversary. Using that understanding of adversary behavior, of their techniques, of their infrastructure, every aspect that we can collect, and using that to inform our defensive strategies, whether that's in architecting systems and security engineering, whether it's in actual running of our SOCs, if it's in red teaming and adversary emulation. Those are all applications of threat knowledge to improve defense. So how do we take and make the most of this big thing in this community? And what's MITRE's role in that? And as you heard both Rich Byrne and Gary Gagnon talk about in their remarks yesterday and today, MITRE is this weird and unusual beast, this 60-year-old gigantic not-for-profit research and development organization. And we have, I think, a role in this, not just as the creators of attack, but as the convener of a community, that we can do this in a way that is objective and impartial and is non-commercial, but at the same time is informed by a deep understanding of technology and the kinds of problems that animate our work. So then the challenge, as we at MITRE are looking at this, what is it that we can do? Well, I look at that as, what are the problems we as a community can tackle? And I think we heard a number of again, using that practical bent that this has, there are some very practical things that we can do as a community. We can continue to improve and expand and evolve the attack knowledge base. Because ultimately, that's what it is. It's a curated body of knowledge that comes increasingly from all four corners of the world. We can promote, as a number of people talked about today, promote the sharing of actual real data about what adversaries are doing based on attack. And if we can start to collect that data in an efficient and structured way and share it out to the community, we can actually start to make decisions and prioritization based on what adversaries are actually doing and watch how adversaries change over time. That would be an amazing thing to have access to as a community, to answer those questions like, what's going to happen next month? Hard to know that, but if you can see the trend, what's happened over the last 2 years and how adversaries have shifted and evolved, how they've moved from sector to sector or geography to geography, that gives us an amount of insight that we simply don't have today. And finally, we talked about how do we as a community build detections and share them, whether it's reference detections or just community curated analytics. How can we do that effectively? So those are just some of the kinds of problems and opportunities I think we have as a community. And what I'll say today, and just to sort of tease this, is MITRE intends to provide a home that's a little more formal and a little more stable for that community, and we encourage you to stay tuned. So this is hopefully the beginning of this conversation. So with that, I have some thanks. I'd like to encourage us all to thank our speakers. They've done an amazing job. I actually want to do this, not just someone made me do it. I really want to thank MITRE for the investment that it has made, because attack, as I think we've tried to make clear, is actually completely supported by internal MITRE money, internal MITRE resources. It's not sponsored by any other organization. And it's an investment the corporation has been making since 2013, and it continues today. So I will acknowledge the MITRE Corporation and their investment. We have some awesome people. I mean, you know, when you get to work with the Blake Stroms and Adam Penningtons and Katie Nichols and John Bakers and John Wonders and the rest, it's an amazing team that we have that works on attack. And I know I haven't listed everyone. They do an amazing amount of work in a way that I think engenders credibility and trust and confidence in the work. So let's hear it for the core attack team. And, you know, as I think Ryan and Dave said, people always forget the event staff. Well, we didn't. So our event staff has really hit it out of the ballpark with this. This is an event the likes of which MITRE has never seen or put on. And there's a huge group of people who've contributed to that. But the person, when we said 3 or 4 months ago at most, you know, we're thinking of doing a conference around attack. The person who said, well, if you're serious about that, we're going to have to get going right now, is the director of our strategic communications and cyber, or I probably just, Nancy Steelberg. So Nancy. And because we knew you'd need a drink, this is signed by the core attack team.
Great.
Thank you.
No flag?
No, no. So just a final reminder, we will be sending you a survey. Please give us your unfiltered feedback. It's critically important to help us improve future events. And so this brings us to the close of the first ever ATT&CKcon conference. Thank you to everyone who participated here in McLean. Thank you to everyone who viewed the live stream online. And stay tuned as we begin the next exciting chapter for the attack framework. This is just the beginning.